You will give me 4 sons at once. That's what my husband told me on our wedding night, his hands gripping my face so tight I thought my jaw might crack. Not a hope, not a dream, a demand, an order. And for the next several years of my life, I wasn't a wife. I was an experiment. A body to be controlled, measured, monitored by 4 identical men who believed I was the key to replicating the miracle of their own birth. My name is Dorothy Rain. I'm 76 years old, and folks around here in Elmwood, Tennessee know me as the quiet widow who tends the rose garden at First Methodist Church. They see my weathered hands pruning flowers every spring, hear my soft voice in the choir on Sundays, watch me shuffle down Maple Street with my canvas shopping bag. They think they know me, they don't know nothing. What they don't know is that for years I wasn't a woman at all. I was a vessel, a science experiment wrapped in Sunday dresses, a body that belonged to 4 men who all wore the same face. I've carried this story inside my chest for so long, it's worn grooves into my ribs. Every breath I take moves around it, careful, like the way you step around a hornet's nest. But I'm old now. And the dead don't stay buried forever, do they? Secrets have a way of clawing up through the dirt, especially when you stop having the strength to pack the soil down. So I'm going to tell you everything. Not because I'm brave, Lord knows I've been a coward most of my life, but because if I die with this locked inside me, it dies too. And maybe someone needs to hear it. Maybe there's another woman out there right now thinking the love she feels is real, not seeing the cage being built around her, one sweet word at a time. This ain't going to be easy for me to say. And it might not be easy for you to hear. There's going to be parts where I stumble, where the years get tangled up in my head like old thread. My memory ain't what it used to be. Sometimes I can't remember if something happened in spring or fall, if the curtains in that house were blue or green. But what I felt, how my heart beat so hard I thought it would crack my ribs. The taste of fear so thick in my mouth I couldn't swallow, that I remember like it was yesterday. I'm going to start at the beginning, back when I was young and foolish and thought a handsome smile meant a good heart. Back in Elmwood, Tennessee, where the mountains carry fog and secrets in equal measure. Back when I met a man named Raymond and thought I was the luckiest girl alive. I wasn't lucky. I was chosen, and there's a difference, honey. A big, terrible difference. If you've ever ignored a warning sign because you wanted to believe in love, comment chosen below, because this story gets darker than you can imagine. Elmwood, Tennessee in 1969 was the kind of place where everybody knew your business before you did. A town of maybe 6,000 souls tucked into the Smoky Mountains like a secret somebody forgot to tell. We had 3 churches, Baptist, Methodist, and Pentecostal, a grain mill you could hear from 2 miles out, a diner called Ruby's that smelled like bacon grease and possibility, and a main street where old men sat on benches whittling and watching life go by at the speed of molasses. I was 27 years old and working at Morgan's Pharmacy, which sounds almost quaint now, don't it? But back then, it was respectable work for an unmarried woman. I lived with my grandmother in a little white cottage on Sycamore Street, and every Sunday after church, she'd remind me that I wasn't getting any younger, that all my high school classmates were married with babies. That maybe I was being too particular. I wasn't particular, I was careful. I'd seen what happened to girls who married the first boy who smiled at them. I'd watched my cousin Linda marry Bobby Perkins when she was 18. Watched the light go out of her eyes by 20. Watched her shoulders hunch forward like she was trying to make herself smaller, less of a target. I told myself I'd wait for something real. Something that felt like the love songs on the radio, like the movies we watched at the Starlight Drive-In. Then Raymond Burke walked into the pharmacy on a Tuesday afternoon in November, and I thought my waiting was over. He was handsome in that solid, reliable way. Not pretty like a movie star, but strong-featured. Dark hair just starting to silver at the temples even though he was only 39. He had working man's hands, clean but weathered. And when he smiled at me from across the counter, asking where he might find the aspirin, something warm spread through my chest like honey in hot tea. "Aisle 4, I told him, and I could feel my cheeks going pink. "Left side about halfway down." "Much obliged," he said, and his voice had that low, gentle quality that made you want to lean in closer to hear it better. He came back 3 days later, didn't need aspirin this time. Needed advice on what kind of soap might be good for sensitive skin. The next week, it was something else. By December, we both knew he wasn't really there for the merchandise. "Miss Dorothy," he said one afternoon, lingering by the counter after paying for a pack of gum he probably didn't even want. "I wonder if you might allow me to take you for supper at Ruby's sometime. That is, if you don't think I'm being too forward." I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. Grandma was thrilled. Raymond owned his own land, a good-sized farm on the outskirts of town. He was established, stable. A little older, sure, but that just meant he was mature, responsible, ready to settle down proper. Our courtship was sweet, almost old-fashioned. He brought me wildflowers from his property, took me to church socials, sat with me and Grandma on the porch swing while fireflies blinked in the gathering dark. He was gentle with me, patient, never pushed for more than a chaste kiss goodnight. He seemed safe. Like a port in a storm I hadn't even known I was sailing through. It was on our sixth date, sitting in his truck overlooking the reservoir while the sun set in streaks of orange and pink, that he told me about his brothers. "I've got something unusual about me, Dorothy," he said, and there was something in his voice, a kind of reverence maybe, or pride, something not many folks can claim. "What's that?" I asked, thinking maybe he was going to tell me he could play the piano or speak French or something charming like that. "I'm a quadruplet," he said, turning to look at me with an intensity that should have warned me, but I was too young and too smitten to recognize danger when it stared me right in the face. One of 4 boys born together. Identical in every way, me and my brothers were something special, Dorothy, a miracle of nature. I remember being fascinated. I'd never met a twin before, let alone someone from a set of 4. "That must have been something growing up," I said, "always having playmates who looked just like you." "It's more than that," he said, and he took my hand, held it tight. "It's a bond most people can't understand. We're not just brothers. We're parts of a whole, 4 pieces of the same soul." The way he said it made something flutter in my stomach, but I convinced myself it was romance, not warning. I convinced myself that the fervor in his eyes was passion, not obsession. We married in April of 1970, a small ceremony at the Methodist church with Grandma crying in the front pew and Raymond's 3 brothers standing beside him as groomsmen. That was the first time I saw them all together. And I won't lie, it was unsettling. 4 identical faces, 4 identical smiles, 4 pairs of the same dark eyes watching me walk down the aisle. I couldn't tell which one was Raymond until he stepped forward to take my hand. But I shook off the unease, told myself I was being silly, that of course it would be strange seeing 4 of the same person, told myself I'd get used to it. I never did. Type wedding if you've ever ignored a red flag on your wedding day, because what happened that night changed everything. The wedding night, Lord, how do I even talk about this? We drove to the little farmhouse that would be our home, the one Raymond had fixed up for us. White clapboard with black shutters, a porch that wrapped around 3 sides, fields of tobacco and corn stretching out in every direction like a green ocean. It should have been perfect. It should have been the beginning of everything I'd dreamed about. Instead, it was the night I learned what I really was to him. We were in the bedroom, small and simple, with wallpaper that had tiny blue flowers, and he was tender at first. Careful, like he'd been during our courtship. But then, right in the middle of everything, he stopped, pulled back, looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, hungry and calculating and almost scientific. "Dorothy," he said, and his voice had changed, gone hard and certain. "You need to understand something. You're not just my wife. You're the answer to something my brothers and I have been waiting for our whole lives." I didn't understand. My heart was pounding, and not in the good way anymore. "Raymond, what are you? You're going to give me 4 sons," he said, and it wasn't a hope or a dream, it was a command, a fact he was declaring into existence. 4 sons at once. Just like how me and my brothers came into this world. You're going to prove that what we are isn't an accident. It's meant to be repeated. It's in the blood, in the bones, and you're the one who's going to show the world. I tried to laugh, thinking he was joking. Maybe trying to be playful in some awkward way, but his hands gripped my shoulders hard enough to leave marks that would purple by morning. "I'm serious, Dorothy. This is why I chose you. You're strong, healthy, young enough. You're going to give me my 4 sons, and they're going to be perfect, just like me and my brothers. It's destiny." That's when I knew. That's when the bottom dropped out of my pretty little dream and I saw what I'd really married, not a man. A mission, an obsession with legs and a wedding ring. The man I loved had never existed at all. And I was trapped in a house 5 miles from town with no car of my own, no phone, and a husband who looked at me the way you'd look at a broodmare you'd just bought at auction. I should have run that very night, but where would I have gone? Back to Grandma, who'd be ashamed that I couldn't make my marriage work. To town, where everyone would whisper that I must have done something wrong to leave such a good man after just one day. So I stayed, and that was my first mistake, but it wouldn't be my last. Comment a number 1-10 if you're still with me, because this is just the beginning of the nightmare. The first few months, I kept telling myself it was going to get better, that the wedding night was just nerves, just Raymond getting carried away with some foolish notion that would fade once we settled into married life proper. I kept thinking he'd wake up one morning, look at me like a husband should look at a wife, and we'd laugh about how strange he'd been acting. But it didn't get better. It got more deliberate. Raymond started keeping notebooks. Little spiral-bound things that he'd write in every night before bed, his hand moving across the pages in tight, careful script. At first, I thought maybe he was keeping accounts for the farm, tracking expenses and crop yields the way farmers do. But one afternoon when he was out checking the irrigation, I worked up the courage to look. The notebooks weren't about tobacco or corn or soybeans, they were about me. My monthly cycles tracked with the precision of a scientist. What I ate each day, he'd written down every single meal, noted when I had seconds, marked if I didn't clean my plate. My weight, which he'd apparently been measuring somehow when I wasn't paying attention, maybe when I was still half asleep in the mornings. There were charts, actual hand-drawn charts with dates and numbers and little codes I couldn't decipher. And in the margins, he'd written notes, temperature readings, times of day, moon phases, for Lord's sake, like I was a garden he was trying to time for planting. I remember standing there in our bedroom, the notebook shaking in my hands, feeling my lunch rise up in my throat. This wasn't love, this wasn't even close to love. This was something else entirely, something that had a cold, methodical heartbeat instead of a warm one. That night at supper, I tried to act normal. We sat at the little formica table in the kitchen, and I'd made pot roast the way Grandma taught me, with carrots and potatoes swimming in gravy. Raymond ate mechanically, barely tasting it. And then he informed me that starting tomorrow, I'd need to eat more protein, more eggs for breakfast, red meat at every dinner. He'd read somewhere, and here his eyes got that bright, feverish quality they took on whenever he talked about his plans, that women who ate high-protein diets were more likely to have multiple births. I wanted to tell him that wasn't how bodies worked, that you couldn't just force a woman's womb to split an egg into 4 pieces like breaking apart a dinner roll. But I'd learned already that disagreeing with Raymond only made him more determined, more convinced that I just didn't understand the vision yet, that I'd see eventually, so I ate the extra eggs. Choked down steak when my stomach wanted something light and simple. Let him document it all in his terrible little notebooks. Type notebooks if this is giving you chills, because it gets so much worse. The visits from his brothers started about 4 months into our marriage. Thomas came first, arriving on a Saturday afternoon in a truck that looked just like Raymond's. I was hanging laundry on the line when I heard the engine, and for a moment I thought Raymond had come back from town early. But when I turned around, I saw it was one of the brothers. I could tell by the slightly different way he walked, a little hitch in his right leg that Raymond didn't have. He didn't say much at first, just stood there watching me pin up Raymond's work shirts. The way he looked at me made my skin crawl, not in a lustful way, somehow that would have been less disturbing. No, this was clinical, measuring. He walked a slow circle around me, and I stood frozen with a clothespin in my hand, not knowing what to do. Then he reached out and touched my hair, just ran his fingers through it once, and nodded to himself like I'd passed some kind of test I didn't know I was taking. He left without saying a word. Drove off in his truck, leaving me standing in the yard with my heart hammering so hard I thought I might faint. When Raymond came home, I told him about it, thinking he'd be upset that his brother had shown up unannounced and touched his wife without permission. Instead, he smiled, actually smiled like I'd just told him I'd won a prize at the county fair. He said Thomas had wanted to meet me properly, to see for himself that the brothers were all invested in this, all waiting to see if I could do what needed to be done. That's when I first understood that this wasn't just Raymond's obsession, it was all 4 of them, a shared delusion that had been growing between them for years, maybe decades. And I'd stumbled right into the center of it like a rabbit into a trap. The other 2 brothers came the next month together, Michael and Samuel. I still couldn't tell them apart from Raymond unless I was looking right at their hands. Michael had a scar across his knuckles. Samuel was missing the tip of his ring finger from some long-ago accident with farm equipment, but their faces were identical. Their voices were identical. Even the way they tilted their heads when they were thinking was exactly the same. They came for Sunday dinner, which I had to cook for 5 people instead of 2, and they sat around our table talking in a way that made me feel like I wasn't even there. They'd finish each other's sentences, laugh at jokes nobody had told out loud, communicate in some silent language that came from sharing a womb and 40 years of life, and they watched me all through dinner. Even when they were talking to each other, I could feel 4 sets of identical eyes tracking my movements. The way I served the food, how much I ate, the way I sat, the way I breathed. I was a specimen under glass, and they were the scientists taking notes. After they left, Raymond was almost giddy. He told me the brothers approved, that they thought I was strong enough, healthy enough, that the bloodline would be pure through me. I asked him what he meant by bloodline, and he looked at me like I was simple. He explained that he and his brothers weren't just regular quadruplets. They were identical in a way that almost never happened, something the doctors who delivered them called a medical marvel. 1 egg that had split and split again, creating 4 perfect copies. And they'd made a promise years ago, when they were young men, that one of them would recreate that miracle. Would prove that they weren't just an accident of nature, but something that could be reproduced, controlled, perfected. Raymond had been chosen, or maybe he'd volunteered, I never got that part clear, but he'd spent years looking for the right woman. Someone young and strong with good birthing hips, Lord, the way he talked about my body, like it was a piece of equipment he'd purchased, and when he saw me at the pharmacy, something told him I was the one. I wasn't his choice. I was his project. If you're feeling sick to your stomach right now, comment project because I need you to understand this was my reality for years. That night, I lay awake in the dark, listening to Raymond breathe beside me. And I finally let myself think the thought I'd been pushing away for months. I'd made a terrible mistake, the kind you can't take back, the kind that reshapes your whole life into something you don't recognize. But I still didn't know how terrible it would get. I still thought this was as bad as it could be. A husband with a strange obsession, brothers who made my skin crawl, a life that had turned into something other than what I'd imagined. I didn't know yet that Raymond's obsession had a plan, a method, a timeline, and that I was running out of time to be just his wife. Soon I'd become something else entirely. The changes started so gradual I almost didn't notice at first. Little things, Raymond moving the cereal boxes around in the kitchen, putting the cornflakes on the top shelf where I couldn't reach without the step stool, making sure I asked him for help. The phone, we had a party line that we shared with the Johnsons down the road, suddenly wasn't working right. Raymond said the wire must have gotten damaged in that thunderstorm we had, said he'd get around to fixing it when he had time. He never did. My trips to town became less frequent. He'd go into Elmwood for supplies and come back saying he'd already picked up everything we needed, no reason for me to make the drive. When I mentioned wanting to visit Grandma, he'd remind me how busy the planting season was, how he needed me there to help with the farm accounts, with the cooking for the hired hands, with a dozen other things that somehow always needed doing right then. I was being isolated, cut off piece by piece from everything outside that farmhouse. But the way he did it was so gentle, so reasonable sounding that I couldn't quite put my finger on when I'd stopped being a wife and become a prisoner. It was in July, 4 months after the brothers' visit, that I found the second set of notebooks. These ones were hidden better, in a locked drawer in Raymond's workshop, the little shed behind the house where he kept his tools. I'd gone out there looking for a screwdriver to fix a loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet, and I found the drawer hanging open just a crack. He must have forgotten to lock it that morning in his hurry to get to the south field. The notebooks inside were older, the pages yellowed and soft at the edges. The handwriting changed from page to page. Sometimes Raymond's tight script, sometimes a looser hand, sometimes writing so cramped it was nearly illegible. But all four brothers had written in these books. All four had contributed to what I was reading. They'd started keeping these records when they were 20 years old. The first entry was dated 1951, written in what I'd later realize was Thomas's hand. It described their mother, how she'd carried them, what she'd eaten, how the doctor had reacted when he delivered 4 identical sons instead of the single baby everyone expected. There were measurements, weights, descriptions of how each brother had been positioned in the womb. Then the entries jumped ahead to when they were in their 20s. They'd started researching, visiting libraries, writing to doctors, collecting any information they could find about multiple births, about identical siblings, about genetics and heredity. The notebooks were full of newspaper clippings, medical diagrams torn from textbooks, hand-copied notes from scientific journals. And then, about 10 years before I married Raymond, the entries changed tone. They stopped being just research. They became a plan. They decided that one of them needed to father quadruplets, needed to prove that what they were wasn't random, wasn't just a fluke of nature, but something that could be replicated. They saw themselves as perfect, as a kind of ideal that should be continued. And they believed, Lord help me, they truly believed, that if they could just find the right woman and control the right conditions, they could force it to happen again. Raymond's entry from 6 years ago made my blood run cold. He'd written about seeing me at the pharmacy, about how I had the right build, the right coloring, the right age. He'd written about courting me being a necessary step, about gaining my trust before revealing the true purpose. He'd written about the wedding night like it was the start of an experiment, not a marriage. I wasn't Dorothy to him. I was subject A. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped the notebook. I wanted to vomit. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run out of that shed and keep running until I hit the state line. But my legs wouldn't move. I just stood there reading entry after entry, each one worse than the last. Each one revealing new layers to how carefully they'd planned this, how long they'd been preparing. There were diet schedules, exercise regimens they wanted me to follow, optimal times of day, optimal times of month. They'd calculated everything, charted everything, planned everything except for the one factor they couldn't control, my body's refusal to cooperate with their insanity. Because here's what I hadn't told Raymond yet, what I'd been too afraid to admit. We'd been married 5 months and nothing had happened. No pregnancy, not even a scare. Just month after month of disappointment that made Raymond's jaw tighter and his eyes harder. I'd started to hope in a desperate, secret way that maybe I couldn't have children at all. that my body would save me by simply refusing to participate in this nightmare. I'd even started praying for it, asking God to forgive me for such a terrible prayer, but please, please let me be barren. I put the notebooks back exactly as I'd found them, made sure the drawer looked closed but not quite latched, and walked back to the house on legs that didn't feel like mine. That evening, I cooked dinner like always, set the table like always, sat across from Raymond like always, but everything had changed. I'd crossed some invisible line in my head, and there was no going back across it. I knew now what he was, what they all were, and I knew I had to get out. But knowing and doing are two different things, aren't they? I had no money of my own. My paycheck from the pharmacy had stopped the day I got married, and Raymond handled all the farm accounts. I had no car, no phone that worked. The nearest neighbor was a mile away, and even if I walked there, what would I say? That my husband wanted me to have quadruplets, that his brothers were involved? It would sound insane. They'd think I was the crazy one, and part of me, Lord forgive me, part of me was still afraid of the shame, of being the woman who couldn't make her marriage work, of disappointing grandma, of proving everyone right who'd whispered that I'd waited too long, been too particular, and should have been grateful any man wanted me at all. So I stayed, days stretched into weeks. Raymond's frustration grew more obvious. He started timing things with a stopwatch, can you imagine? Treating our bedroom like a laboratory. The brothers started visiting more frequently. At first it was once a month, then every 2 weeks, then every week. They never stayed long, just came to observe, to confer with Raymond in low voices I wasn't supposed to hear, but I heard anyway. Heard them discussing me like I was a crop that wasn't yielding properly. And I knew deep in my bones that something worse was coming. It was late September, almost exactly 6 months into our marriage, when everything I'd been dreading finally took shape in front of me. The air had turned cooler, that first hint of autumn that makes the mountains look like they're on fire with color. I remember because I was standing at the kitchen window washing dishes when I saw all three brothers' trucks coming up the long driveway, one behind the other like a funeral procession. My hands went still in the soapy water. They never all came together unless Raymond had called them, unless something had been decided. They stayed outside for a long time, the four of them standing in a circle near the barn, talking in that way they had where their heads would tilt at the same angle, where their hands would move in identical gestures. From the window, they looked like one person and his three shadows, except all the shadows were solid and real and just as dangerous as the original. When they finally came into the house, I had coffee ready. Years of living with Grandma had taught me that you always offer hospitality, even when your hands are shaking so bad you can barely hold the pot steady. They sat around the kitchen table, all four of them, and I could feel the weight of their stares as I poured, 4 sets of eyes, 4 identical faces, all watching me with that clinical interest that had become so familiar I'd almost stopped noticing how wrong it was. Raymond was the one who spoke, but I could tell the words had been rehearsed, agreed upon beforehand by all of them. He said they'd been patient, that they'd given nature plenty of time to take its course. That 6 months was more than reasonable for a young, healthy woman to conceive, and the fact that I hadn't meant that their approach needed to be adjusted. I stood there by the sink, my back against the counter, because I didn't trust my legs to hold me if I didn't have something to lean on. I asked him what kind of adjustment he meant, even though part of me already knew, had known since that night I'd found those notebooks. He laid it out so calmly, like he was explaining a crop rotation schedule. Said that maybe the problem was that the conditions weren't quite right, that they'd been thinking about it all wrong, that he and his brothers were 4 parts of one whole, and maybe that's what was needed here. 4 contributors to create 4 results. It was symmetry, he said. It was natural order. It was what God intended when he made them quadruplets in the first place. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the counter so hard my knuckles went white, told him no. That wasn't natural. That wasn't right. That I was his wife and his alone. My voice came out small and thin, like it belonged to someone else, someone far away. Thomas spoke up then, his voice gentle in that terrible way that made everything worse. Said I was being emotional, not thinking clearly, that there was no difference between them really, not in any way that mattered. They were identical down to their very souls. What one could give, all 4 could give. It wasn't like I'd be with strangers. It wasn't infidelity when they were all essentially the same person. I started crying then, couldn't help it. Told them I wanted to go home, wanted to see Grandma, wanted to leave. Raymond stood up, came over to me, and put his hands on my shoulders in what might have looked like a comforting gesture if you couldn't see his face, couldn't see the determination there that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with control. He said I was his wife and this was my home now, that I'd made vows before God, that I had a purpose to fulfill and running away from it wouldn't change what needed to happen. His grip tightened just enough to make sure I understood this wasn't a discussion. It was a decision that had already been made. The three brothers left after that, drove away in their identical trucks while I stood at that kitchen window again, watching them disappear down the dirt road. Raymond came up behind me, close enough that I could feel the heat of him, and told me I had 1 week to accept this willingly. After that, he said, my cooperation would no longer be required. I understood the threat. Lord help me, I understood it perfectly. That night I lay awake in the dark, listening to Raymond breathe beside me, and I finally let myself think the thought I'd been pushing away for months. I was going to die in this house. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually, whether my body broke from being used like a breeding animal, or whether one day I'd simply give up and stop fighting, the end result would be the same. I'd die here and nobody would ever know what really happened. Just another farm wife who couldn't handle the isolation, who maybe got sick, who maybe had an accident, unless I found a way out. And I was running out of time to find it. That week felt like living underwater. Everything was muffled and slow and hard to breathe through. I went through the motions of being a wife, cooking Raymond's meals, washing his clothes, keeping the house clean. But I wasn't really there. Part of me had already left, had already started planning an escape I wasn't sure I could actually pull off. Raymond watched me constantly now, not even subtle about it anymore. He'd stand in doorways when I was working in the kitchen, lean against the fence when I hung laundry on the line, position himself where he could see me no matter what room I was in. It was like being studied by a hawk. All that patient predator attention focused on prey that had nowhere left to run. The only money I knew about was what Raymond kept in a lockbox in his office, the small room off the kitchen where he did the farm accounts. I'd seen him open it a few times, watched him count out bills to pay the hired hands or settle up with the feed store, but the box was locked and I didn't know where he kept the key. Friday morning, I started looking. Not obviously, I couldn't risk him noticing I was searching for something. But while I was dusting, while I was putting away laundry, while I was moving through the house doing all the ordinary tasks of an ordinary housewife, I was also checking drawers, feeling along the tops of door frames, looking for anywhere a small key might be hidden. I found it Saturday afternoon, tucked inside an old tobacco tin on the top shelf of the closet in Raymond's office. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out, but I got that tin down, opened it with shaking fingers, and there it was, small and brass and ordinary looking, like it didn't hold the only possible key to my freedom. I didn't take it, not yet, couldn't risk him noticing it was gone. But I memorized exactly where it was, exactly how the tin was positioned, so I could find it again in the dark if I needed to. Sunday morning came cold and clear, one of those autumn days where the sky looks like glass and every breath you take hurts going down. We got ready for church in silence. I put on my best dress, the green one with the pearl buttons that Grandma had made for my wedding shower, pinned my hair up proper, put on the lipstick Raymond liked, even though my hands were shaking so bad I nearly drew it crooked. The whole drive to town, I was calculating. The service would last about an hour. Then there'd be coffee and fellowship in the church basement, which Raymond never liked to stay for, but today he probably would, showing off his devoted wife to the congregation one last time before whatever horror he had planned for this afternoon. That gave me maybe 2 hours, possibly 3 if I was lucky. 2 hours to grab that key, open that lock box, take whatever money was in there, and disappear before Raymond and his brothers came home to claim what they'd decided was theirs to take. It wasn't much of a plan, it probably wouldn't even work, but it was all I had and time had just run out. Church that Sunday felt like a fever dream. I sat in our usual pew, third row from the back on the right side, and Pastor Williams preached about obedience and faith and trusting in God's plan even when we don't understand it. Every word felt like it was aimed directly at me, like the whole congregation knew what I was planning and were warning me against it. But when I looked around at the familiar faces, Mrs. Patterson with her hat that had too many feathers, old Mr. Jessup sleeping with his chin on his chest, the Morrison twins fidgeting in their Sunday clothes, nobody was looking at me any different than usual. They didn't know, nobody knew. I was completely alone with what was happening to me. After the service, just like I'd predicted, Raymond lingered. He usually couldn't wait to leave, but today he stood on the church steps shaking hands, making small talk about the harvest, accepting compliments about the farm with a modest smile that made me sick to look at. He was performing, showing everyone what a normal, upstanding man he was, building up credit he could cash in later if I tried to tell anyone what really went on in that house. Grandma found me by the coffee urn in the fellowship hall. She looked older than I remembered, more lines around her eyes, and I realized with a guilty pang that I hadn't seen her in over 3 months. Raymond had made sure of that. She asked how I was doing, if married life was treating me well, and I opened my mouth to tell her everything, to grab her hands and beg her to help me, to take me home, to do something. But when I looked past her shoulder, I saw Raymond watching us from across the room, and the words died in my throat. I told Grandma I was fine, that everything was wonderful, that I was just tired from all the work of keeping up a farmhouse. She patted my cheek and said that's what marriage was, hard work but worth it. And she was proud of how well I was adjusting. If she only knew what I was adjusting to. We finally left the church around noon. And as Raymond drove us home, one hand on the wheel and one hand on my thigh, he told me the brothers would be arriving around 2 o'clock, that I should prepare a nice meal, something special, because this was an important day. A day we'd all remember. The way he said it made my stomach turn over. Back at the house, I went through the motions of making dinner, peeled potatoes, seasoned a roast, set the table for 5. My hands did all the familiar tasks while my mind raced ahead, calculating timing, planning movements, trying to figure out how I could possibly pull this off. Raymond went upstairs to change out of his church clothes. I heard him in our bedroom, heard the creak of the floorboards, heard the closet door open and close. This was my chance, maybe my only chance. I moved fast but quiet to his office, grabbed the tobacco tin from the top shelf. The key was there, small and brass and solid in my palm. I shoved it deep in my apron pocket and put the tin back exactly how I'd found it, then hurried back to the kitchen just as Raymond's footsteps started down the stairs. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. But he just walked past me to the living room, settled into his chair with the newspaper, completely unaware that I'd just stolen the first piece of my escape. The trucks started arriving around 1:45. First Thomas, then Michael, then Samuel, parking in a neat row like soldiers reporting for duty. They came into the house smelling like aftershave and purpose, and they all looked at me the same way, not like a person, but like a problem they were finally going to solve. We sat down to eat at 2:30. The roast was perfect, potatoes creamy, green beans cooked just right. I'd set out the good china and poured sweet tea into the matching glasses. It looked like a celebration. It felt like a last meal. They talked among themselves while they ate, discussing farm business and weather patterns and tobacco prices. Normal conversation that felt obscene given what they'd gathered here to do. I barely touched my food. Just pushed it around my plate and tried to breathe normal, tried to look calm, tried not to let them see that I was planning to destroy everything they'd worked toward. After dinner, Raymond sent me to the kitchen to clean up while the 4 of them moved to the living room. I could hear their voices, low and serious, discussing the final details of their plan. I stood at the sink with my hands in dishwater, looking out the window at the long driveway stretching toward the road, toward freedom, toward anywhere but here. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky. In a few hours it would be dark, and in the dark I was going to run. It was close to 4 o'clock when Raymond called me into the living room. My legs felt like water, but I dried my hands on my apron and walked in there, trying to keep my face blank, trying not to let them see the terror that was crawling up my spine like ice. They were all sitting, arranged in a semicircle on the couch and chairs, and they looked at me with identical expressions of what I guess they thought was kindness. Raymond did the talking. Said they'd discussed it among themselves and decided on an order, a schedule. He'd go first, of course, as my husband, then Thomas, then Michael, then Samuel. They'd document everything carefully, track every variable, give this experiment the structure it needed to succeed. The way he laid it out so calm and organized, like he was describing a business plan, that's what finally broke something inside me. Not broke me down, but broke me open. All the fear and submission and trying to be good, trying to survive by being small and quiet, it all cracked apart, and what came rushing out was rage. I heard myself say no, just that one word. But I said it loud and clear, and it echoed in that living room like a gunshot. Raymond's face changed. The false kindness dropped away, and what was underneath was cold and hard as January ground. He stood up, and the other 3 stood up with him, moving in sync like they were connected by invisible strings. And suddenly they were all standing, and I was the only one sitting, and I felt the threat of it, the physical reality of being outnumbered 4-1. He said my cooperation would make it easier, but it wasn't actually necessary. They'd decided. And what they decided would happen whether I agreed or not. I stood up too because I couldn't bear being lower than them anymore. Told them I'd go to the sheriff. I'd tell everyone in town. I'd make such a scene that everyone would know what kind of men they really were. Thomas laughed. Actually laughed, this short, bitter sound that made my skin crawl. Said no one would believe me over them. 4 respected farmers against one hysterical wife who couldn't handle rural life. Raymond took a step toward me, then another. The other 3 fanned out slightly, positioning themselves between me and the doors. He said we were going upstairs now, that I could walk up there with dignity or they could carry me. My choice. I looked at each of them in turn. 4 versions of the same face. 4 sets of eyes, all watching me with that patient predator look. And I knew with absolute certainty that if I went upstairs with them, I wasn't coming back down the same person. So I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed. Not words, just sound. the loudest, most piercing sound I could force out of my lungs, and while they were still startled, still processing what I was doing, I ran. Shoved past Raymond, ducked under Thomas's reaching arm, and ran for the front door like my life depended on it. Because it did. If you're holding your breath right now, comment run, because what happens next will either save me or destroy me. And I still don't know which.